In eye care, 2020 vision means clarity, but leadership requires us to see beyond 2020, beyond the day-to-day, beyond the challenges, and beyond what's possible. Welcome to Beyond 2020 Leadership. I'm your host, Tamara Nord. Today, we're talking about something every leader faces, yet many leaders avoid: difficult conversations. Whether it's addressing performance concerns, attendance issues, team conflict, or accountability, these conversations can feel uncomfortable. Many leaders delay them. Some avoid them altogether. Not because they don't care. Usually it's because they care very deeply. They don't want to hurt someone's feelings. They don't want to damage a relationship. And they definitely don't want to create tension. But here's what I've learned throughout my leadership journey. The conversations you avoid today often become the bigger problems you will need to manage tomorrow. Courageous leadership isn't about being harsh. It's not about confrontation. It's about caring enough to have that conversation. So let's talk about what that looks like in eye care leadership. Most leaders aren't afraid of the conversation. They're afraid of the outcome. They're worried someone will become upset. They're worried that they'll lose trust, that they'll damage the relationship. But here's the irony. Avoiding the conversation often causes more damage than having it. When expectations aren't addressed, performance suffers, team morale suffers, patient experience suffers, and trust suffers. Because your highest performers are watching at all times. Your team is going to notice standards aren't being upheld. Patients eventually are going to feel that impact. Leadership requires the courage to address issues early, not because you're looking for problems, but because you're protecting the team. Courageous leadership isn't about speaking harder. It's about speaking honestly, choosing clarity over comfort, addressing issues while maintaining dignity, believing someone is capable of growth. One of my leadership beliefs is this: accountability is an act of care. When we hold someone accountable, we're communicating that we believe they can improve. We're investing in their future. The leaders who have the greatest impact on me weren't the ones who ignored my blind spots. They were the ones that were willing to help me see them and talk me through them. Let's talk about performance conversations. This is probably the most difficult conversation leaders face. And many leaders make the mistake of waiting until frustration builds. And by that time that they speak up, now emotions are involved. The better approach: address issues early. Address behaviors, not personalities. For example, instead of saying, "You're not committed," try, "I've noticed several deadlines haven't been met. Help me understand what's getting in the way." Of these, one is going to feel like judgment. The other invites discussion. The goal isn't to win. The goal is understanding and improvement. And as leaders, we should enter performance conversations curious and not accusatory. I remember working with a team member who had tremendous potential. They were very talented, smart, well-liked, but their follow-through wasn't consistent. For a while, I convinced myself it would improve on its own, and it didn't. Eventually, I sat down and I had an honest conversation with the individual, not about what they were doing wrong, but about the gap between their potential and their performance. And what surprised me was their response. Instead of becoming defensive, they appreciated the feedback. They let me know that no one had ever been that direct with them before. And that conversation became the turning point, not because I criticized them, but because I believed in them enough to have the conversation. And today, one of the lessons I carry forward as a leader is that people often rise to the expectations we communicate. I often think about another issue that I have to have a lot of conversations around, and that's attendance issues. Attendance conversations can feel uncomfortable because life happens. People face challenges. Unexpected situations arise. Great leaders are going to lead with empathy. But empathy doesn't eliminate accountability. Attendance matters because reliability is going to impact the entire team. And in eye care, when someone isn't present, schedules are affected, patients are impacted, workloads shift, stress increases for everyone else. The best approach is balancing compassion and clarity, acknowledging the person, address the impact, discuss expectations moving forward. All employees want fairness, and fairness requires consistency. Not very often, but occasionally, team conflict becomes a conversation. And again, when I think about how many leaders dislike even more than performance conversations, they dislike having conversations around team conflict. And one of the biggest mistakes leaders make is hoping that conflict will resolve itself. Sometimes it does. Often it does not. Unresolved conflict creates tension, and tension affects communication. Communication affects teamwork, and teamwork affects the patient experience. Patients can absolutely feel when the team is not aligned. And as leaders, we must facilitate healthy conversations, not take sides, not become the referee, but help people focus on solutions. And a question that I often ask is, what outcome are we trying to achieve together? Because that's going to shift the conversation from positions to purpose. And purpose is where progress is going to happen. How do we hold people accountable without losing trust? Because many leaders believe accountability damages trust. And I personally believe the opposite is true. When this is done correctly, accountability builds trust. Because trust is built through consistency. People trust leaders who are honest. People trust leaders who address issues fairly. And people are going to trust leaders who hold everyone to the same standard. Your team doesn't expect perfection, they just expect consistency. And one of the greatest compliments a leader can receive is, I always know where I stand with you. Because that's trust. And I think about having high-performing teams and how do they handle accountability. Because high-performing teams don't rely solely on the leader for accountability. The culture supports it. Team members understand expectations. They support one another. They communicate openly. They address issues respectfully. That's when something very powerful happens. The leader no longer carries accountability alone. The team begins protecting the culture together. And when that happens, patient experiences improve because consistency is going to improve. Communication improves. Collaboration improves. Patients may never see the accountability conversation, but they are absolutely going to feel the results of it. I want to share a story and how I look at leading with empathy and accountability. I remember an employee who was going through a very tough and difficult divorce. And like many leaders, I knew pieces of what was happening in their personal life, and my heart was generally aching for them. They were carrying a lot emotionally, and it was one of those situations where you could understand why someone might be struggling. And over time, though, I started noticing changes at work. Their interactions with patients became shorter and less patient-centric. Their communication with their teammates became more reactive. Frustrations, very small frustrations, seemed to trigger them, and bigger responses over time. I could tell the team was feeling it. Patients were feeling it. And if I'm being honest, I delayed the conversation longer than I should have. Not because I didn't see the issue, because I cared about them. I kept telling myself, they're going through a lot right now. Maybe things will improve. But eventually, I realized something important. Compassion doesn't mean avoiding accountability. In fact, avoiding the conversation wasn't helping them, the team, or our patients. So I sat down with them privately and I started acknowledging what they were going through and letting them know that I cared about them as a person. And then I shared what I was observing. And I explained that while I understand that they were facing these personal challenges, the impact was beginning to show up in the patient interactions and the team dynamics every day. What I remember most was the look of relief on their face. And instead of becoming defensive, they became very emotional. They admitted that they didn't realize how much they were bringing into work. And that conversation again became a turning point. Together, we talked about support, resources, expectations, and what success would look like moving forward. And over time, I watched them regain their confidence. Their relationships with the teammates improved, and their patient interactions improved. Most importantly, they felt supported rather than judged. And the lesson I learned was this: that leadership isn't about choosing empathy and accountability, because the best leaders can do both. Because when we care enough to have the conversations, we're not criticizing the person. We're helping them become the best version of themselves during one of the most difficult seasons of their life. And that's what courageous leadership looks like. That's a lot to reflect on. So when I think about this week, I really want to present a leadership challenge. So as we wrap up today, I want to challenge you to think about one conversation that you've been avoiding. Maybe it's a performance discussion, an attendance concern. Maybe it's a conflict between two team members. Maybe it's an accountability issue. Now ask yourself, what is the cost of continuing to avoid it? What impact is it having on the team? What impact is it going to have on your patient experience? Then make a commitment, not to criticize, not to control, but to help someone grow. That's leadership. The best leaders aren't the ones who avoid difficult conversations. They're the ones who approach them with courage, empathy, and clarity. Because leadership isn't about comfort. It's about responsibility, and it's about helping people become the best versions of themselves. And sometimes that begins with a conversation we've been avoiding. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Beyond 2020 Leadership. Until next time, keep leading with purpose, and remember to see beyond today.